Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for braving the icy paths and snowy streets to join us this afternoon. It's really a great pleasure to see you. I'm Michael Barr. I'm the Joan and Sanford Weill Dean of the Gerald R. Ford School of Public Policy here at the University of Michigan. I'm delighted to welcome you all to our 18th Josh Rosenthal Education Fund Lecture, which this year features Michael Breen, President and CEO of Human Rights First. Before introducing Mike, I'd like to share the history of this lecture series. The Josh Rosenthal Education Fund was established in memory of Josh Rosenthal, a 1979 University of Michigan graduate who died in the World Trade Center attacks on September 11, 2001. After Josh's death, his mother, Mary Lynn Rosenthal, a longtime faculty member in sociology at the University of Michigan Dearborn, sought a way to make some positive meaning of what had happened on that day. She and others worked to establish the Josh Rosenthal Education Fund, which has enabled the Ford School to bring leading public policy figures to Ann Arbor each fall to share their insights, foster dialogue, and create a greater sense of understanding around the causes and consequences of 9/11 and other pressing global issues, including international human rights. Harriet Berg, Josh's aunt, is in the audience today, sitting in the back, waving to us. Thank you very much, Harriet and your family, for your generosity and for allowing us to address the significant global issues of human rights advocacy and to mark what would have been Josh's 40th year anniversary of his graduation from the University of Michigan. Let me turn now to today's speaker, Mike Breen. Mike recently took over the helm of Human Rights First about a year ago. Human Rights First, as many of you know, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan international human rights organization with offices in New York, Washington, D.C., Houston, and L.A. Human Rights First serves as an independent advocacy organization active around the globe. Previously, Mike, an Army veteran, served as president and CEO of the Truman National Security Project, a nationwide membership organization of leaders inspired to serve in the aftermath of 9/11. And after leaving the military, he served in the White House in the Office of General Counsel, and in law school, he co-founded the International Refugee Assistance Project, a program providing legal advocacy for refugees and displaced people. We're delighted to have him here today as a Rosenthal speaker and to hear his lecture, Human Rights on the Brink. Before I turn the podium over to Mike, let me just say a word on format. We'll have some time towards the end for questions from the audience. Two students, Sarah Wagner, an MPP candidate, and Mary Kay Hazel, an MSW candidate, from the Public Policy Seminar, The Role of Courts in International Human Rights, with Hardy Vieux, our policymaker, Towsley policymaker in residence, teaching this semester, and coincidentally, Vice President for Legal Affairs of Human Rights First, will sift through your question cards and pose them to our speaker during the question time. And so now please join me in welcoming our speaker, Mike Breen, to the podium.
Thanks a lot. Thanks very much to Dean Barr, and thank you so much to you and to the family for making this possible. 9/11 was, for all of us, and certainly for me, a day that touched my life very profoundly in ways that I think we'll probably talk about tonight. So it's especially meaningful to have the opportunity to speak about these human rights issues in this context. I'm from a small town in New Hampshire. Portsmouth, New Hampshire is where my parents live, and where I was living at the time of 9/11. I was a senior in college. And even in that small town, it turned out one of the flight crews that flew out of Logan on that day lived in Portsmouth and commuted to Logan Airport. And so even this small, tiny New Hampshire town, we lost people that day. And it transformed my life, sent me to war in two different conflicts, and really changed the entire trajectory of my life. It's a genuine pleasure to be here in Ann Arbor, especially to be indoors here in Ann Arbor and be with all of you. And I look forward to a robust conversation. But before we get there, I've been asked to bore you with some remarks. I'll do my best to make them as interesting as I can. The subject today is the modern human rights movement. What it's been, what it is, and some thoughts about what it needs to become. What it needs to become if it's to remain relevant, let alone essential. So I'm here to make a case for change. First, this question of why do I care? What's brought me to human rights? It's an interesting question. I think if we went around the room and asked everyone here to define human rights, and there's some extraordinarily educated, qualified people in this room, I have no doubt, I suspect we would probably get as many answers as there are people sitting here with us. It's a concept that's become difficult to define. And it's a concept, I think, that in many cases is starting to lose or is at risk of losing its relevance to us. But what is it? It's our rights as human beings. It should be fundamental to us. It should be organic. Understanding human rights should be like understanding our own breathing. For me, my experience with human rights and with understanding what it means to me is tied up with 9/11 and my experience as an Army officer. So if you'll indulge me, I'll tell you a brief story. In 2003 and 2004, I was about 23 years old. I found myself as a second lieutenant with 1st of the 6th Infantry, Bravo Company, in Baghdad, Iraq. A war that I had written as an undergraduate the previous year was deeply misguided as a response to 9/11, and a war I was now all of a sudden charged with fighting. I saw a lot of things during my time there. But one set of experiences I had, I watched the beginning of an insurgency in Iraq. And a lot of the form that took was car bombings. People were building car bombs and driving them into infrastructure projects, among other things that I was responsible for. So I would work to rebuild a school or a hospital or revitalize a piece of infrastructure with local Iraqi contractors, and then insurgents would try to blow up what we had just built. So like a lot of my fellow soldiers, I got into the business of trying to hunt down bomb makers. And I remember the first one of these raids, but there were dozens of them. I'm an Eagle Scout, small town New Hampshire. My dad is a retired law enforcement officer. I remember hearing things about the rights of the accused in due process when I was about 3 years old. My dad used to tell me it's better to let 10 guilty men go free than convict one innocent person. It was like a mantra that I grew up with. So I internalized these concepts very deeply. And I remember going through the door on our first raid about 3 in the morning and having a pretty good idea that the person I was going to detain was somebody who took money to kill strangers by building bombs. But of course, you go through the door, and what do you find? You find a family, terrified in the middle of the night as armed men enter their home. And I remember talking to them, sitting them down, and I don't know if my words meant anything to them. But I remember saying, look, we are different from the soldiers that might have been here 6 months ago under the previous regime. We're not going to shoot your dad in the front yard. We're Americans. This is the flag that I'm wearing. We don't torture people. And I must have said that dozens of times to different families. And every single one of those people ended up at a prison called Abu Ghraib. So many months later, still in Iraq, I walked down into the basement of an Iraqi police station during the Battle of Najaf and Fallujah. The insurgency is now in full swing. I'm there to inspect the conditions of the prisoners. There's a big holding cell in a basement full of men behind bars. One big cell. And they see me coming down the stairs and they panic because of the uniform I'm wearing. They're basically begging the Iraqi police, don't let that guy take me. And that's how I found out about what had happened at Abu Ghraib. Some of you remember this vividly. For some of you, the photograph of the man with the jumper cables and the hood on the box. Turns out, all those people I'd told their families, we're Americans, we don't do that sort of thing. Well, they'd all been subjected to unspeakable conditions. In many cases, tortured, I think. And I thought to myself, how did we become this? And that's the kind of experience. How did the flag, how did the uniform become this? And that's how I got interested in human rights. in a rigorous way. That's how I left the military, went to law school, became involved in refugee issues, eventually made my way to this organization. An organization, by the way, whose name I didn't know at the time, but whose work I saw. An organization that had rallied the most senior former military leaders in the nation to stand against torture. A campaign that many of you probably remember. That was Human Rights First. That's how I came to know them. So that's why I care. That's why I'm here. And that's why I care very deeply about the future of the human rights movement that I'd like to talk with you about a little bit today. And some of what I have to say is critical. Some of what I have to say is potentially provocative. But it comes from a place of deep both hope and deep personal stake in the future of these values and the future of this movement, and what I think is an absolutely critical time for all of us. So first, a little history. Very familiar to some of you. The modern human rights movement grew out of the ashes of World War II and the Holocaust. Its founding document, the Universal Declaration, drew on ancient principles and traditions as it articulated the Roosevelt's vision of a peaceful post-war world built on respect for human rights and human dignity. So this was both a simple and a radical idea. The notion every human being possesses certain legal rights by virtue of her humanity, that every government was obligated to respect those rights. That this was more than a matter of philosophy, this was a matter of law. Beginning with the Universal Declaration in 1948, the Geneva Convention in 1949, the United States spearheaded the formation of a global system of human rights, a network of laws, agreements, tools, and institutions that was meant to make rights a reality in the lives of people all over the world. And this system, bolstered, if not always heeded by the United States and its allies, helped spur the growth of democracy and respect for human rights worldwide. Activists and movements regularly invoked universal ideals and used the human rights system in their own political battles in their own countries. Activists likewise relied on the United States for support and looked to it for inspiration. And I think we should be careful not to romanticize this. I'll speak more about America's human rights record a little later. But in the decades after World War II, and especially after the early 1970s, the United States showed itself to be, for the most part, a highly functional and progressing pluralistic democracy that welcomed a large number of newcomers, greatly reduced economic inequality, and allowed a large measure of political freedom. Freedom that gave social justice movements an opening to mobilize and fight for their rights. The degree of freedom, the upward trajectory, hard fought as it was, made it reasonable for the human rights movement to champion American leadership. And it wise for it to leverage it, American leadership, on behalf of human rights activists in other countries. At the same time, the human rights system was a vital political instrument for the United States. As decolonization occurred at great speed and great scale around the world, the United States could differentiate itself from the Soviet Union by hoisting the banner of human rights. This is not to say that it was mere branding. The United States put real money and effort into building the human rights system. My point is that in the context of the Cold War, it was clear that championing human rights was both the right thing and the smart thing to do. An ethical as well as a strategic imperative. Throughout the Cold War, the United States, most of the time, could do well by doing good. So listen to Václav Havel. The first opposition movements, or so-called dissident movements, which emerged in the Soviet bloc at that time, had one thing in common. They all cited the Helsinki documents, as well as other papers binding governments to respect human rights and liberties. To these movements, the Helsinki Accords were an inspiration, a shield, a chance to resist coercion and to make it difficult for the forces of coercion to retaliate. An inspiration and a shield. The Helsinki Accord was non-binding. Its stated purpose was actually to ease tension between the East and the West. But combined with other factors, including the courage of activists and the power of the United States, it helped change the world. That was 1989. Democracy and capitalism, also referred to as liberal internationalism, had prevailed. But as we all know now, the end of the Cold War did not usher in a period of great progress on human rights and democracy, at least not the way we imagined. So what happened? That is a long conversation, and it's an important one. I think for today it's enough to point out that several common assumptions turned out to be faulty. There's a common thread to these assumptions, and to many more that we won't talk about right now. Many forces and tools that we once believed would inevitably favor the advancement of human rights turned out to be double-edged swords. It was widely believed, for example, that economic growth would lead to democratization and a call for more rights. The reality, unfortunately, is that some autocrats have succeeded in linking their rule to economic gains and security. China, for example, has succeeded, in part through massive indoctrination, in convincing its population that economic progress is made possible only by rejecting the messiness of democracy and embracing party rule. We've also learned that even in countries with secure political and legal rights, the majority of the voting public will not always vote to defend the humanity around them. The rejection of refugees by the European Union and the United States is but one reminder that possessing rights does not automatically extend them to others. And unfortunately, given the persistent problems we see in our headlines today in the United States and other Western democracies, it's getting more difficult to make the case that liberal internationalism and other human rights respecting forms of governance are manifestly superior to other systems. So all around the world, authoritarians are actively exploiting the failures and struggles of democratic countries, this is nothing new, and the corruption of elites to gain and consolidate power. There's a related assumption that was common at the end of the Cold War, that the global financial system would be a tool against authoritarians, much as it was in the mid-20th century. The reality is that authoritarians, in some ways it has been, but that authoritarians have used it to enable corruption and maintain power. I'm talking about so-called dark finance, without which, by the way, there's probably no such thing as President Donald Trump. But I'm also talking about a lot of activity that happens right out in the open. Here's a fourth assumption that's been revealed as wrong or questionable, that the diffusion of technology would favor democratizers and activists. The reality is that sometimes it does, but also that the centralization of communications technology, the development of exquisite cyber means to target activists, and the dispersion of surveillance capitalism for monitoring wide swaths of a population has helped tyrants suppress activists. And the reality is also that violent extremists have often leveraged the same technology more effectively than the activists have. I could go on, but here's a fifth and final assumption that it pains me to say is no longer supportable 3 decades later, unfortunately. The United States will remain an example that other countries necessarily wish to follow and emulate. This was an assumption of the post-Cold War. The United States began the century. Cast your mind back to the year 2000. The United States began the century as a respected and unrivaled military, economic, political, and in many ways moral power. One that provided valuable public goods to the world and maintained a relatively benign global order. The country was, if not the envy of the world, then it certainly was its dominant player. And it was eminently credible across nearly every field of human endeavor. Military strength, economic might, financial competence, political system, the maintenance of international institutions. But consider America's record in the eyes of the world since the turn of this century. And in many ways, I'm describing my lived experience as an adult American who graduated from undergraduate in 2002. Illegal torture on black sites in the wake of 9/11. The 2003 invasion of Iraq and the long, awful war that followed. The 2008 financial crisis and subsequent recession. The 2016 election and the continuing awfulness of our politics. Across nearly every field of human endeavor, American superiority has been humbled, and our basic competence in major areas of geopolitics and statecraft have been called into question. And unfortunately, that's just a reality we contend with now. As for U.S. moral leadership, it's already taken some major hits before January of 2017. CIA torture, the wars in Yemen and Syria, the United States had either committed or allowed some pretty horrific human rights abuses in the decades before the current administration. And today, we have arguably the first administration since the Second World War to stand in open opposition to human rights. I don't need to recite the litany of transgressions. Suffice to say, this administration has overseen a collapse of American credibility on human rights. And in addition to tremendous concrete human harm, this has created a problem for activists and for movements who might otherwise rely on American influence to advance claims to universal human rights. So it's no wonder that the many protest movements rising up around the world are increasingly using localized rhetoric and organizing principles. Unlike the Arab Spring movements of 2011 and 12, the Umbrella movement, other movements, right? Today's protesters are largely turning away from universal human rights language. In part, this is because, amid worldwide stagnation, widespread anger over corrupt or inept governance, the focus of many protests is economic. For example, the event that spurred the Yellow Vest protests in France was an increase in fuel taxes. In Chile, the current enormous protests began as a response to a subway fare hike. In Lebanon, it was a tax on WhatsApp messages. But it's also clear that human rights, the concept, the system, the universal language, and its greatest traditional champion, the United States, holds less promise for activists who are coming up with strategies for their movements today than it did 10 years ago. All the large protest movements around the world, they're taking place in at least 20 countries right now. They're a sign of hope, but they're also a sign of acute distress. Authoritarianism is ascendant in many places. As dictators, quasi-dictators, would-be fascist movements from Brazil to Hungary to China exploit and incite anger against racial minorities, migrants, quote-unquote globalists, and international institutions. The growth of technology has aided them in many cases, giving them new powers to spy on and otherwise control citizens. It's also facilitated the mass dissemination of disinformation, undermining the very concept of truth and threatening not only individual rights such as the right to privacy, but also individual autonomy and agency, with things like the sophisticated manipulation of individual perception and choice by machine learning algorithms and AI and other techniques. So the future is very uncertain, and it's coming fast. If you want a glimpse of it, of what it might be, if we fail, consider Western China, where ethno-nationalist authoritarianism meets a new Charles Dickens-style capitalism, using ever-progressing technology to expand its power and to suppress dissent. Where an algorithm predicting that you will have low social compliance in the future can mean you can't get a bank loan or go to college, or can get you locked up indefinitely in a re-education camp, forced into slave labor making consumer goods, forced to renounce your native language and your religion. Then there's the minor matter of climate change, which threatens to exacerbate inequality and make refugee crises perpetual, which would in turn empower the darkest forces in our societies. We've seen a foreshadowing of this, I think, play out in our own country over the last 3 years. I've been talking in terms of concepts and generalities, but behind those concepts are human beings, people who live or die, people who suffer or thrive, depending on whether our government and other governments respect their fundamental human rights. As the Dean mentioned, before coming to human rights first, I co-founded an organization when I should have been in class in law school that helped refugee families and spent a lot of time on the ground in places like Lebanon, Jordan. That kind of work is still vital. We must be internationalist. But to focus on the problems overseas at the expense of those or the exclusion of those in the United States is self-defeating. There are, after all, profound and defining human rights problems, from extremist violence to the crackdown on refugees to the deterioration of our democracy right outside our own front doors. And there are, of course, seasoned activists already working in these spaces. And human rights organizations should enter them with humility. We have much to learn, more to learn than to teach, but we also have expertise to lend. And by becoming more focused on the problems close to home, we can gain credibility as well as constituents. Human rights movement's been largely DC-centric for a long time, focused on influencing the federal government of the United States. I have nothing against organizations with a strong Washington presence. I work for one. And that advocacy matters a lot. But the movement needs to broaden its base of supporters and build deeper connections to communities across the country. I think to acknowledge this obligation to be active citizens in our own communities is part of acknowledging a larger truth. American values are central to the tagline of my organization. But American values are not a given. They're not etched in marble, not really. They're a choice. They are a choice we make every day and we make in every generation. Like the human story, the American story is the story of a continuing conflict between our basest instincts and the better angels of our natures. We, as Americans, are the Middle Passage, and we are both sides at Gettysburg, and we're Selma. In June of 1939, the United States, driven by xenophobic fear, sent nearly 1,000 Jewish refugees aboard the ship the St. Louis from an American port back across the Atlantic to Nazi-held Europe, where almost everyone was murdered in a death camp who was on that ship. In June of 1944, the same America, the same president, the same greatest generation began the liberation of Europe by storming the beaches at Normandy. These are both the American story. These are both American values. We have choices to make every day. And I don't think to say this is to denigrate America. I think it's to begin to grapple with the true meaning and the true responsibility of patriotism. Because there's never been some golden age, some nostalgic golden age of human rights in the United States. What there has been, though, is a never-ending struggle for human rights. It's gone by many names. And that struggle has many victories and moments of transcendent courage that can and should inspire us to do our own duty in our own time, to our neighbors, to our communities, as well as to the global movement for universal values and universal rights. And I don't think to focus on fixing problems at home is to ignore human rights activists in other countries. In fact, I think one of the best things we can do for activists overseas is to restore or create American credibility on human rights. As I hope I've made clear by now, the capacity of the U.S. government, and by extension the human rights movement, to forge progress in other countries depends in large measure on American credibility. And it would be great if the U.S. government were a shining example to the world. But it is essential that we demonstrate a baseline level of commitment to the cause. That is indispensable. But let's face it, the U.S. government is not going to regain credibility overnight. The human rights movement and the world cannot afford to wait for that. Human rights advocates should look for ways to take matters into our own hands. Let me put it this way. We should continue to press the government to protect human rights when possible. And we should fight to protect human rights despite our government when necessary. It's a lot of work that we're focused on right now at Human Rights First. And we're early in the process of formulating that work. It's also part of our traditions. Hardy right now is leading many pieces of impact litigation that are about taking matters into our own hands, to fight for our clients. We have a new chief technology officer who's joined us from the Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory to help us develop new technology tools to fight for human rights, work with human rights defenders, and expose abuse. We're still early in the process of formulating a lot of this new work and this new strategy. But what I do know is that we cannot sit around and wait for a better U.S. government to materialize. And even when it does materialize, the human rights movement needs to be more proactive and more creative. Along with a group of other human rights advocates, I recently met with a group of Uyghurs from Western China. Expatriates, all of them. Every one of them had a family member, in many cases many family members, who were detained in these camps. They hadn't been able to speak to, didn't even in many cases know if they were alive. And at one point, one of the leading members of this community looked at us up on the panel and said, look, my colleagues and I have been in this fight at great personal cost. And we are watching the destruction of our community. We can't sleep. And we haven't seen much of a response. Where's the hope? What do you have to offer us? What can you do to help us? And what ensued was a conversation about, one of my colleagues spoke up, an eminent leader in another human rights organization, one of the very best in the business. And she gave what I thought was a perfect encapsulation of the advocacy environment in Congress and with the State Department and other organs of the federal government. It was not an optimistic outlook. And then she talked about what we might be able to do next quarter to advocate for stronger action. Nothing wrong with what she had to say. But I realized at that moment that couldn't be our answer ultimately. That it's not enough to say, well, we asked the government to help you. And the government said no, so we'll ask them again tomorrow, and that's it. That's all we can do. We've got to have better answers. Part of that answer could be more defensive technology to enable a human rights activist to work securely. It could be the sharing of tactics, such as the diffusion of knowledge for how to extinguish tear gas canisters that appears to have spread from Hong Kong to Chile. Continuing to develop new tools and techniques to hold human rights abusers accountable that don't rely on U.S. government action. Connecting human rights defenders and their allies in American civil society and around the world to one another through responsive, rapid, securely designed networks. Relentlessly improving our advocacy techniques. Mastering the art of persuasion in the digital age. I don't have the answers yet, but I'm committed to finding them. So is our team. Because we'll try again tomorrow just isn't a good enough answer. It could be that as I, and perhaps you, I hope, many of you, search for new pathways to progress, we discover we need a new language of human rights. Maybe even new rights themselves. After all, the Universal Declaration was written 20 years before new research started that would eventually evolve into the internet. Before globalization brought down borders. Before the impact of climate change was felt on a daily basis by millions of people. The changes I've outlined call for a new lexicon. Perhaps protest movements around the world are already birthing one. Listening carefully to these movements, looking for traces of the universal in their increasingly particular language and goals, is fertile ground for new research and scholarship, if anyone here is interested in that sort of thing. It could also be that we need a new, broader, interdisciplinary vision for human rights. For example, as more people live more of their lives online, there's a need for a basic human rights framework that empowers and protects them in the digital space. The very definition of human is in some ways expanding, to include, for example, social media profiles. In the inescapable wake of data we leave behind us with our every action and every day, the definition of human rights, seems to me, needs to expand as well. Digital human rights, the right to be forgotten, for example, or to access the internet, or to be free from forced exposure to things like child pornography or disinformation. They're worthy of our deep consideration. These are important debates to engage in. I'd like to leave you with a final set of thoughts, and then I hope we can have a great conversation. And that final set of thoughts is that the politics of the moment can be all-consuming. But if we lift our gaze just a little bit, if we consider what the influence of renewed authoritarianism, extremist, ethno-nationalist populism, unsustainable and transparent inequality, and climate change, together with rapidly advancing technology, if we think about what that change means for human rights, I think we begin to see that we're probably in the opening stages of a new, very different, and probably existential struggle for human rights. I think we begin to see that if we fail in that struggle, much of what we've inherited and built ourselves may be at risk. I think we begin to see that we may be facing a battle for the meaningful definition of any rights at all. But on the brink of crisis, there's also opportunity. For too long, we've allowed human rights conversations to be about harms perpetrated far away against people far too few of us know. We allowed human rights to be about what we, relatively powerful and safe in America, would be willing to do to help those who are not so lucky. That obligation, of course, remains. That conversation, of course, continues. But this moment, finally, I think, has begun to crystallize for many of our neighbors, for many of us, that human rights is about us too. That the dignity, agency, and future potential of every one of us is not guaranteed, even into the rest of the century. As technology, as ethno-nationalist politics alike leap across borders, as mass migration continues, as climate change reminds us that the only real border is the atmosphere, that everything else ultimately is permeable, we've really got no choice but to finally recognize that all 11 billion plus of us are well and truly, whether we like it or not, in this thing together. And I think there's growing awareness that the risks we face are universal. They're shared by all. So let this be also a moment for the reassertion of universal values and universal rights. There's tough questions to answer. The future of the human rights movement is not remotely written, but I would invite you all to help us write it. Thank you.
Can you guys hear me in the back? Is it working? Hi, Mr. Breen. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Sarah Wagner. I'm an MPP student here at Ford in my first year with interests in racial and gender equity as well as human rights broadly. Very excited to hear you speak today. So we will get started with a question from the audience. Is there a need for other countries to rely on the USA or follow us as an example regarding human rights? Is it still relevant to do so today?
That's a great question. I think the question was, is there if I can paraphrase it, is there a need for other countries to follow the example of the United States when it comes to human rights, and is that relevant today? I think I would offer kind of two thoughts on that. If by example what the question refers to is moral perfection or a complete lack of hypocrisy, absolutely not, right? But that's never been true. If the question is, does U.S. power and leadership on human rights in the world matter? The answer is yes, tremendously. And I think it, in a funny way, matters more almost as the United States is going through, I think, what can just be objectively defined or viewed as a decline in its relative power compared to other ascendant powers in the world, right? As the United States becomes less relatively powerful compared to the rest of the world than it was in like the 90s when we were unbelievably relatively powerful, right? Then a renewed emphasis on institutions, norms, and agreements that can lock in an international order based on human rights, that I think that the need for that redoubles, right? We have to get much more interested in building those institutions and committing to those institutions, right? So pulling back from international institutions, pulling back from a rights-based order is the exact opposite of what I think we should be doing. Is it relevant for other countries to look at the American experience? Absolutely, of course, just as it's relevant for us to look at the experience of other countries. As a person leading a nonprofit in the United States that is about human rights, right? Sure, we have expertise that we can share across many disciplines. We're trying to acquire more expertise and experience. We want to be generous with those things. But it's also very likely that a successful NGO leader in a place like Hungary probably has more to teach me right now than I have to teach her. So that exchange matters a lot. So U.S. power matters tremendously. There are, about 350 million of us that get to vote in American elections. That election has an impact, a life or death impact in many cases on 11 billion plus other people. I don't think we should walk around wearing that responsibility lightly by any stretch of the imagination. It matters massively what this country does or doesn't do. If you don't believe me, ask a Syrian or ask an Iraqi or ask someone from Yemen.
Thank you for being with us here today, Mr. Breen. My name is Mary Kay Hazel. I am a second-year Master of Social Work student, about to graduate in December. Woo.
Okay.
And I study social effects of policy in both domestic and global contexts. So I really appreciate the things that you said about human rights, not just being a global issue, but also a domestic issue. Another question for you on the U.S.'s role. Over the past 2 decades, I have seen the U.S. government be very selective in terms of critiquing human rights violations across the world based on the U.S.'s strategic, political, and economic relations with the violating country. Should we be realistic and accept this fact/reality? Is it practical to hold countries to the idealistic principles of human rights?
Interesting. Hypocrisy is part of international relations. I wish it were not, it is. I would make a couple of quick points. First, I think imperfect adherence to a set of principles, an imperfect champion is much better than no champion at all. It matters tremendously whether the United States is imperfectly advancing human rights, maybe not honoring them in the breach all the time, or openly rejecting the system. And that has huge implications. The second point I would make quickly is that no, as activists, as citizens, I don't think we should accept these things. Of course not. I think speaking truth to power is my job. I think it's the job of all of us who are part of human rights. That's not to say that I am a naive individual who believes that I live in a utopian world in which we will always win that argument. But one of the things I think it does really point out is that effective, and this is a huge part of the tradition of Human Rights First, and a huge part of what I have admired about the organization long before I joined it, was that we're a human rights organization that is comfortable with making pragmatic arguments. Successful advocacy is often the product of moral force and legal right combined with an argument or appeal to enlightened self-interest, figuring out where those things align. And I think this underlines a larger point we didn't really get to in the lecture except in the context of the Cold War, but I would continue to argue that it is absolutely, irreducibly in the United States' strategic geopolitical interest to be a human rights champion. And I'm more than happy to get into that conversation and hope we can. It is in our self-interest to do that, without question. In fact, I'd say it's probably strategically critical that we do it. And so I think making those arguments matters.
Wealth disparity worldwide seems to play a role in many of the destructive trends that you've described, with many supporting systems against their own interests. Should that be a major focus in the human rights movement?
This is a perennial one, right? This is the argument about whether human rights should or should not encompass economic rights, for lack of economic justice, let's call it. I don't think there's ever going to be an answer to this question. I would point out a couple of things, though. To the extent that the theories of advancing human rights internationally were based on the idea that you could have perpetual economic growth everywhere and that would just keep happening, that's not going to happen for a whole bunch of reasons. So there's a faulty assumption there. And then I already mentioned another faulty assumption, which is that economic growth, in the absence of human rights advancement, will produce human rights advancement. This is a major argument that's been applied to many, many countries, including China, right? Now we're running the experiment. China's incredible achievement, unprecedented in human history, has been lifting an unbelievable number of people out of life-crushing, soul-destroying, abject poverty in an unbelievable amount of time. The theory was that that would produce essentially a middle class that would then call for rights. To some extent that's happened. To some extent it hasn't, right? So there's a shaky relationship between economic justice and human rights, I think. And it's worth looking into from a theoretical perspective. From a practical standpoint, it's very hard to pull them apart right now. Excuse me. Excuse me. I'm allergic to the question, forgive me. But as I mentioned earlier, if you look across these 20 plus countries where protest movements are happening, almost every single one of them has a deeply economic rationale. That's the straw, even if there's a lot of politics at play too, and rights, searching for rights, the straw that breaks the camel's back over and over again is economic. So it's hard to pull these things apart.
Okay, another question, this one specific to Human Rights First. What steps is your organization taking in regards to the human rights abuses taking place in detention facilities on our borders? And a corollary, how do we as citizens take active steps to fight and oppose these abuses?
Great question, and thank you. This is something that we've been incredibly involved in, both on the detention issue and a bunch of related issues, including one I'm happy to speak about, this very perverse policy called the Migrant Protection Protocols, which we call the Migrant Persecution Protocols, which involves essentially forcing asylum applicants to return to Mexico, often in extraordinarily dangerous situations. Places that the State Department will not permit its own employees to be, for example. Too dangerous, too lawless. We, every day, drop migrants off there to fend for themselves. What are we doing about this? For its entire history, Human Rights First has been one of the leading, if not the leading, coordinator and source for pro bono, for free legal representation to asylum seekers in the U.S. legal system. So we've been doing asylum since the organization existed, 4 decades of this. We have a legal team that is at the absolute forefront of this area of law, and we do a lot of policy work on this area of law and have for a long time. When I say we do policy work, I'm referring to things like this organization essentially drafted the Refugee Act of 1980 that created the system. We've never seen and never anticipated the level of political attack and abuse of the system we're seeing now. We seem to be facing a government that is essentially attempting to destroy its own asylum system. And so our response to that has been multifaceted. We're continuing to represent our clients, provide them with the very best legal representation we can provide. We're doing that in the face of an administration that is making that harder in every conceivable way that it can. Often in pretty clear violation of law. We're in the litigation business in a way we haven't been. It's a large part to Hardy's leadership of our board of directors, the organization, not habitually the kind of organization that files lawsuits. We've filed a number of them with our partners. We did that not because we wanted to get into the business of doing shiny impact litigation. We did that because it was the best way to defend our clients' rights. We're engaged in zealous advocacy in Congress and with the federal government. Most of that, frankly, has been preventing even worse things from happening. We've been able to expose abuses, though. We're doing a lot of reporting on what's going on. We send our staff to places that are, frankly, pretty high-risk places, like Nuevo Laredo. We're currently compiling data to put up a microsite that will expose all the different instances that we can identify of violent abuse of migrants who've been subjected to MPP, and documenting those cases. What we do with that later, well, we'll see. But we're surfacing that evidence. Myself and many of my colleagues have made trips to the border, made trips to the Mexican side of the border, talked to people, documented abuses, testified before Congress. I testified before a House Oversight Committee about what I had seen, what I had documented. And we're doing this as relentlessly as we can. The team's tired. The team's been running flat out for nearly 3 years. But what we're experiencing is nothing compared to what our clients are experiencing, and we're going to keep this fight up for as long as we have to. What can you do? If you're a lawyer, volunteer your time. There's an infinite need for good legal representation. If you're a lawyer or you're not, look to your own community. I promise you, this is not merely a border issue. This is a great misperception. Asylum seekers and other migrants are detained in facilities all over the country, many of them in rural areas. And there are members of this community, I promise you, within 5 square miles or less of this room, who are currently living in the shadows and going through this process and need every kind of support that you can offer them. What they need to know more than anything else is that if somebody comes for them, their community will notice that they're seen enough to be protected. And you can make yourself visible to them in ways that they can't make themselves visible to you. You have that power. Exercise that power. And finally, get involved with organizations like us. We need the help. We need your time, we need your effort, we need your voice politically. And yeah, we need your money. And if your money's $5, great. We need your retweets. We need you to help us get the message out. And there are many, many organizations in this fight. But this is a time for engaged citizenship. And again, it does not have to be at this esoteric level of call Congress every day. It is in your community. The fight is in your community. And there's a human being, many human beings, nearby, and probably small, scrappy organizations working with them. And the value of you simply saying, I am a citizen of this community, I'm a person of stature in this community, and I see you and I care what happens to you. That could be transformative for them.
Is it possible that our political climate and the current leadership style of the United States will irreparably damage our position as a leading advocate of human rights?
Nothing is irreparable. Nothing is irreparable. Are we in a bad place? Yeah. I just talked for like an hour about what a bad place we're in. Yeah, we're in a bad place. It's true. Without a doubt. But I can tell you this, we are not going to get out of it as a global community unless the United States finds a way to repair itself. Just do the geopolitical math. You can't do this without the United States on the right side of the ball. You can't. There's not enough horsepower realistically in the rest of the world to do it. You need the United States on the side of a rights-based order. We're a pretty low population country, especially compared to our power, which means all of us, just by virtue of being able to vote here, are some of the most disproportionately powerful human beings in the world. So I'm asking you to see yourselves and see your power in that way, but I'm also asking you to see yourselves and see your power in a much deeper way. What can I, as a citizen of a country where I'm relatively safe, where the legal environment is permissive, where I have so many rights and freedoms, what can I do myself to advance this cause, whether my government is doing it or not? And I think once you start to ask yourself that question and you sit with it for more than 5 minutes and you really look at your own capabilities and your own power, especially collectively, what all of us can do together, you start to understand that the answer is pretty big. That's the conversation I want to encourage us to have.
I have a question you may be uniquely positioned to answer.
Uh-oh. Is it about Hardy?
As military spending grows astronomically and development, social, and diplomatic spending tightens, I have seen a militarization of many development and rights projects that were previously run by civil government or nonprofits. What's the effect of moving these functions into military spaces? And what is the role of civil society in pushing back against or fitting into this new reality?
That's a really good question. It's a bit of a double-edged sword. So this question of everything's militarized. In my previous incarnation as the head of Truman, one of the things we worked really hard to do was to create a conversation and help convince everybody that climate change was a national security threat, which was a really effective way of talking about the issue. Turns out to also be true, right? On the other hand, some of the pushback we got was, wait a second, are you telling me that the military is the solution to climate change? The answer is no, of course we're not saying that. But the conversation became tied with the security conversation, especially since 9/11, but the Cold War hangover is part of this too, right? A lot of our debates are had in the context of national security, and talking about national security is, as it turns out, a way to acknowledge a set of equities and to bring the conversation to a certain level. So activists do that a lot. That's one point. Second point is that the United States, in many ways, dramatically and very expensively reconfigured its national security and foreign policy infrastructure to fight a series of counterinsurgency wars, nation-building wars, whatever you want to call them, right? And that got the United States into the business, unfortunately, through the lens of counterinsurgency, of pulling all of these different ways of acting in the world into an attempt to have an integrated security strategy in place. That can be a good or bad thing, but it has major consequences. And then there's the budget imbalance. The Pentagon budget is massive. The 150 account, which is like the rest of foreign policy, is really small. So these imbalances are a really big problem. There is no simple answer to dealing with any of it, unfortunately. But we have to acknowledge it. I think by and large, it's a mistake to completely embrace a military national security frame on foreign policy. Our foreign policy is deeply hampered by that. On the other hand, I think it's also a mistake to dismiss the national security apparatus as a place you can have productive conversations about human rights. We've been doing that for 20 years nearly. And as a result of those conversations, done everything from go from torture to no torture in a deep policy way, to enacting specific reforms to reduce civilian casualties in combat over time. So engaging the military can have benefits. It's a tricky space to be in, but I think viewing it in a pragmatic way is probably the best way to think through. I don't know if that answer is helpful, but hopefully it gives you a sense of the landscape.
How can activists and politicians at subnational levels, cities and states, use human rights framing to advance policy in their spheres of influence? I often hear that talking about rights doesn't feel effective for local politicians. Do you have ideas on community-level human rights arguments that will resonate?
I do, to an extent, yeah. Absolutely, right? I think human rights, at the end of the day, our struggle as human rights is both a very broad concept, almost overly broad, and it's a concept that I think has become a little bit far away from its underlying moral content. And so that I think is the project. When we talk about human rights, what do we mean? I mean, we're back to saying, with this great room of people, all these backgrounds, if I asked you all to define human rights and we run around the room, not only would we be here till Saturday, but I don't know how many answers we'd get, but my guess is at least as many people as are in the room. Which is a challenge. The challenge for me, I lead an organization called Human Rights First, so if I lead an organization called Undefinable Concept First, I'm in serious trouble from a comms perspective, right? So what are we really talking about? For me, I think it's about underlying values that underlie the rules. And there we're talking about things like dignity, we're talking about things like agency, we're talking about things like autonomy, we're talking about things like my ability to realize my own innate human potential in a society that fosters that, and my ability to do all these things in relationship to other people in a web of community. Other people have other ways of talking about it. But I think we've got to zero in on that basic bedrock language. Now, there are different ways those values are enshrined. International human rights principles and laws and obligations is one way. The Constitution of the United States and the Bill of Rights is one way. Many laws we have to protect us domestically at every level of our legal system is one way. So I think we need to see these things as integrated, and I think we need to focus on the content, on the moral content of it, and on the goal. And the goal is that as we collectively create our future, we very consciously do it in such a way that the future is a good place to be human. It's a good place to be a person. It's a good place to have dignity. It's a place to have agency. It's a place to have autonomy. It's a place to say, I can reach my potential and then offer the very best within myself to my community. I can be encouraged to do that. I can be given the tools to do that.
Okay, this will be our last question, and it's a bit of a doozy.
Oh, great.
Gird your loins. Are violent white extremists a threat to human rights that we are underestimating? If so, how does civil society act against them in a way that also inspires further state action?
Yes, they are a threat to human rights. Yes, we are underestimating them. This is something that I moved through quickly, but this is actually, it turns out, a fairly major focus of thought and new programming in our organization. And let me talk a little bit about why. I think it matters whether we're talking about and focusing our strategy, focusing our thought on the question of issues, the way we often think about issue formulations, or whether we're focused on harm to human beings. If we think about this from the perspective of issues, we can think about, as Human Rights First has done for a long time, I think uniquely among major human rights organizations, we can think about anti-Semitism as a human rights issue, as an attack on universal rights, which it is. And we can have a program about that. And we should. We can think about anti-Muslim bigotry as a different program, a different issue. We can think about attacks and assaults on the rights of migrants for whatever reason, as a different issue. We can think about racism in the traditional American context as a different issue. Or we can look at the events of the last few years, at the bulk of the violent harm inflicted on humans, at the manifestos of people who shoot up synagogues and Walmarts in El Paso. And we can see that those manifestos match. We can see that there is an effort to unite these various strains of hate into a new form of ethno-nationalist authoritarian populism in the United States. And the name that goes by right now is violent white extremism. And we can ask ourselves, how do we stand up against that? Then we start to ask ourselves what shape that takes, where that network operates, how that network is funded. Is it only in the United States, or is it international? It's international. And we can ask ourselves, what tools do we need to confront it? Now we're not talking about issues anymore necessarily. We still are. But now we're not a research organization anymore putting out reports about how all each of these issues are getting worse. Maybe we're still doing that. But we're also asking ourselves, what are the tools I need to stand up and fight for my own community against them? And that's the uncomfortable reality of human rights. Human rights violations are not acts of God. Human rights violations are not extreme weather events. Human rights violations are almost always the conscious decision of a group of people to violate the rights of somebody else. And that implies a certain approach to the way we think about fighting back. We're trying to change the incentive structures of people who think they can do that. That's probably enough to say right now. Thank you.
Please join us for reception outside, and thanks for coming.
Thanks a lot.
It was great.